Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. We have a really great show for you tonight. We're going to be responding to the explosive headline that everybody woke up to when they saw Politico this morning called Inside Hillary Clinton's Secret Takeover of the DNC. Of course, when we read the article, none of us were surprised. But with me tonight are two very special guests. I have Tim Canova, who, as everybody knows, is challenging Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's mentioned in the article, for Congress again in Florida. Hi, Tim.
Hi there.
Nice. And I have Sam Ronan, who everybody knows was the most progressive candidate for DNC chair, who is also running for Congress in Ohio. How are you tonight, Sam? I know you're tired.
Hey, I'm hanging in there. I got my coffee, so we're ready to go.
Okay, great. So before we drill down into the specifics of this article and the revelations, I just want each of your off-the-cuff reactions to what you read. Tim, you first.
The only surprise was who this came from, that it came from Donna Brazile. I don't think she said, in some ways, anything that many of us had not already been saying, but I do see it as vindication for a lot of us, especially given the source.
Right. And how about you, Sam?
Honestly, I'm shocked that they even went through this route at all. There doesn't seem to be that much political expediency, yet everybody wants to jump on this train anyway. I mean, as Tim just said, it is vindication, but it's very concerning that now all of a sudden they want to admit that everything was rigged after having purged all of the progressives from the party. So I'm waiting with bated breath to see what happens next.
Somebody posted that, you know, the DNC is a sinking ship and everybody wants to get off, and everybody wants to get off with their reputation intact. And I will say something specifically about Donna Brazile. My reaction when I was reading it is, yeah, you're so heartbroken. It didn't stop you from leaking the CNN questions to Hillary, you know, after you already knew about this. So, you know, it's a very self-serving account, in my opinion. She's no angel. I mean, in 1988, she was working for the Dukakis campaign, and she was forced to resign from that campaign for basically leaking some reports about George Herbert Walker Bush having affairs. Of course, now, since the Weinstein revelations have come out, those accounts are probably true, but still, Dukakis, you know, disassociated himself from the remarks, and she was forced to resign. So this woman is no angel.
I have mixed feelings about Donna Brazile because, as everybody knows, I got into progressive politics very, very late in the game. I ran for state representative as a Democrat in Warren County, Ohio, and that was about all I knew about politics. But when I ran into her and when I worked with her during the DNC chair race, she seemed very amiable. But of course, she is, you know, a wolf in sheep's clothing. So I would say you're correct, Lauren, that she's trying to save as much face as she can, and her political past does have its fair share of bumpy roads. I don't know why she keeps finding herself in positions of power and authority within the party. If they want to keep her in those positions, why go through the motions at all, especially since they've already proven a willingness to disregard their own rules and regulations in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that I would have condoned such behavior had I gotten the chair, but I didn't. So it's par for the course as far as I'm concerned. And if Donna Brazile wants to try and, you know, walk away calmly and with her head held high, let her. But then she needs to stay out. And so does the rest of the party establishment. They've done their time. They've definitely left their mark. I think it's time for the next generation to take over.
Yeah, and especially the fact that they appointed her to the Rules Committee. I thought that was so ironic. And also Steve Battelle, who was the you know, millionaire from Florida, who basically jumped through hoops, or actually had party basically bend the rules for him so that he could beat Dwight Bullard, who was the choice of the Bernicrats to be the Florida state chair. And they put him on the Rules Committee too. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I was very critical just a week ago, I think, when the news came out that Tom Perez had put Donna Brazile on the Rules Committee. I heard about Stephen Battelle being put on it as well. And It raised eyebrows here for the same reasons you just said. The rules were bent rather extensively, if not broken, more likely, to engineer Stephen Battel's rise to party chair. And it's a blemish to have Brazile on that rules committee. I think it's the wrong optics. It's rewarding past misbehavior. And in addition to both of them being on the rules committee, of course, we had a dozen corporate lobbyists that it was announced were being put on, I think, as superdelegates on the DNC. So, you know, take a look at the party, and it's hard to assess, is this party in the process of healing itself and making amends for the past, or is it just more of the same? And on any given day, you could see the tea leaves in either direction. I just got back from Orlando last weekend. The Florida Democratic Party had a conference in which we almost unanimously, the delegates, almost 1,000 delegates, passed a package of resolutions that were incredibly progressive. It didn't have everything that we wanted, but it had an awful lot. And yet, that kind of encouragement, you still, you know, it's reason to be encouraged, I should say, and yet there's still so much to be done.
Now, for those of us that haven't been under a rock for the last year, we already knew this because back in May of 2016, Politico wrote an article in which it talked about how the money was being laundered from the Hillary's Victory Fund to the Democratic, to the state parties, and then right back out of the state parties to the DNC again. None of the state people wanted to go on record as talking about, well, they said that they didn't like it, but they didn't want to give their names because they didn't want to incur the ire of Hillary Clinton and the DNC. But apparently the allegations showed that only 0.5% of the money actually got back to the state parties. And the article talked about the maximum donation that you could give, which was $353,000 and $400, which was an insane, obscene amount of money. And George Clooney even used the word obscene, but he did a dinner, a fundraiser for Hillary, which we protested. Jay Ponte organized that, and Howard Gold allowed us to have it at his house. He was a Bernie supporter who runs Bernie's Coffee Shop. And we threw money at her limousine when it came, and we played that Rosemary Clooney song, "You're in the Money." But as we know, the money did not go to the state parties, and she basically kept it for herself. But what I didn't know until I read the article was that the party was basically bankrupt, $24 million in debt when Donna Brazile came along. And it was partly because, and this is what I'd like you to address, Tim, because Debbie Wasserman Schultz wasn't doing her job. She wasn't good at fundraising, which was supposedly her main job. So can you talk about that?
It's a little mystifying to me what she's been up to, because when you take a look at her legislative record in 14 years in Congress, I think she's introduced less than half a dozen pieces of legislation. There's no signature issue that she's really been behind as a member of Congress. And when we would point this out during the last campaign, of course, it was very easy for that criticism to be deflected that she's busy chairing the National Party. So what exactly was she doing with all of her time if she wasn't really legislating in her full-time job as a congresswoman, and she wasn't raising money at the DNC even after opening it up to corporate lobbyist donations? So it's truly a mystifying record of failure. And I don't know how she really recovers from a lot of this. I think she's really on a downward trajectory.
Well, Nomiki Konst did a great report today on TYT in which she talked about how so much of the money was going to consultants. And there was a particular law firm, as a matter of fact, was one of the consultants that were consulting with Hillary's campaign and with the DNC. And there were all sorts of conflicts of interest. I think the name of the firm was Perkins and Toohey. And she was mentioned, Nomiki, who's also on the rules, the Unity Commission.
Yep.
What do they call that? The Unity
It's the
Reform?
Unity Commission.
Yeah. Was saying that it would be in their interest not to audit the DNC and to let everybody know what was going on because of how much money was going to the consultants. And you know, of course, that Hillary, one of the in the postmortems on the election was that they spent so much money on consultants that they were completely out of touch with what the American people wanted in a candidate.
It's not so much that paying for consultants is a problem because they're the ones that usually have connections to media, networking, donors, and all this other stuff. They're basically just networks and able to allow you to collaborate and just reach people. That's what a consultant is and does. However, the people, like you said, that they were reaching out to were these establishment, sellouts, the ones who only had corporate interests in mind. What we have seen is that there is a need, a desire even, for populism in this country. Bernie Sanders did it without any sort of consulting. He did it by simply saying what he's been saying for the past, 30, 40 years. And we've seen that being replicated time and time again, to a greater or lesser degree, sure, but we don't need consulting anymore. We could save hundreds of millions of dollars by simply not paying people to tell us what we already know is not true. If we would just, again, and I'm not trying to reiterate the campaign in February, but it's as simple as listening to people, literally going door to door, investing in the local communities. That article, the Clinton fundraiser, I believe it was verbatim. Hillary Clinton, it was very up here. It said that Hillary Clinton said that that they would focus on all 50 states. That was the exact talking point, the exact rhetoric that every single candidate that was running for chair was parroting time and time again. And I was the only one that mentioned that. How about we actually focus at the local levels and put our resources where it's needed most? We don't need consultants for that. That's just common sense.
Well, I do want to push back a little bit on that because Bernie did have a very major establishment consultant, and that was Tad Devine. And Tad Devine took a lot of money for commercials. In fact, it came out after the campaign that he didn't even have a cap. A lot of media consultants have a certain cap because they do get a percentage from the ad buy, and he didn't have this cap. And so he made millions and millions off of this campaign. And it did affect, because he was also Bernie's chief strategist as well as his media buyer. And one of his chief strategies was buying television ads from which he profited. And, I ran Los Angeles for Bernie, as you know. Mm-hmm. When his campaign came to California, they only had like $6.5 million cash on hand. And they were told to just avoid media entirely because television is so expensive that they would need to spend at least $2 million just to even make a dent. And unfortunately, and the campaign manager, Mike Sarasso, ended up parting ways with the campaign because they ignored his advice and spent a good chunk of that money. Meanwhile, they only had 50 campaign field organizers, and they had 100 in Little New Hampshire. So they only had 50 here in California. They only had 5 field offices, and 2 of them were volunteer managed. So I can speak from the Bernie campaign that, these consultants muck things up quite a bit.
We don't need to spend millions of dollars. Tim, we figured this out a few years ago, right? There's been plenty of activists. There's been Bernie Sanders, who's been doing this for decades, longer than I've been alive, who figured it out then. The women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, and all of the social movements that have come since, during, and after. We have always understood that the things that we need is a livable wage, an easing of the burden of taxes on the middle class, and the ability to actually achieve some sort of equity, not just equality, actual equity in society. You can look at any number of things, but it all amounts down to that. Being able to take care of the self, being able to live one's life without any fear of reprisal. That is what we should be advocating. Anything that achieves those goals, it's not rocket science.
Well, I certainly agree with that kind of a progressive agenda. I will say, I think, Lauren, you made a good point, though. I recall during my campaign when Bernie called me up to let me know that he was endorsing me, which came completely out of the blue. We spoke for a while about my race. He asked some questions about the district. I'll always remember the last thing he said. He said, don't trust the consultants. They'll promise everything. They'll take your money and they'll leave you with nothing. And you take a look at the campaign that we had last time. In my one congressional district, we had 4 field offices, and we had, I think, about 60 full-time campaign staffers. Most of them were field organizers and deputy field organizers, and then an awful lot of volunteers. So it was a big commitment to a ground game. And Bernie, I think, Lauren, your point about the Tad Devine team taking an awful lot of his money was true. And on the one hand, they did some very good commercials. I'm sure it helped his campaign. But in some key states, Florida being one of them, I think Bernie had 1 field office in all of South Florida. Yeah. So it wasn't a vibrant field game here. You take a look at Florida politics, and the criticism of the state party year after year, way before Stephen Battelle became party chair, was that the party really existed to feed money to consultants. And it was always a list of just a few consultants. I mean, you could probably count on one hand the number of consultants that were getting 90% of the party's money here in the state of Florida. And many of the consultants were based in Washington, D.C., are based in Washington, D.C. They're not even here in Florida. So I do think, this is a big problem. And when you cross the consultants, of course, you start getting a lot of bad press. After Bernie had endorsed me, Tad Devine sent a team down to my district. They stayed here for less than 24 hours and went back to Washington and sent me an email telling them that I would need to give them $1 million. Yeah. And I, we really didn't have that kind of cash on hand. We were spending we're spending a lot of our resources first to raise money. When you're not taking PAC money and you don't have those interests behind you, to raise money, you've got to spend a lot on social media advertising, and that's what we were doing. So didn't have the money to hand over $1 million, and we parted ways. And when we parted ways, the Tad Devine team made sure to give some parting shots, denigrating the viability of my campaign to the local press. It was really demoralizing to see that happen. We didn't let it dampen our campaign, but to see human beings treating each other that way, it was demoralizing.
Yeah, it's really disheartening to hear now. I'm working on a campaign, Michael Bracamontes for governor, and he's one of what we're calling the corporate-free candidates here in California, along with Stephen Jaffe, who's taking on Nancy Pelosi, David Hildebrand, who's taking on Dianne Feinstein, and Gail McLaughlin, who's running for lieutenant governor here in California. She's running as no party preference, and a whole host of other corporate-free candidates that are out there in California. And it's really disheartening when I hear from fellow Bernie-crats that, questioning my guy's viability because, he doesn't have the experience, he doesn't have the name recognition, and he doesn't have the money. And I have to point out to them, well, that's what we are here for. If he's got the most progressive platform, which he does, because I'm helping him have the most progressive platform, then we're the ones who have to make him viable.
I've had to weather that argument not once, not twice, but 3 times now. The first time when I ran for state representative, when I ran for DNC chair, and now again when I'm running for Congress. You're too young, you're too inexperienced, you don't have any victories, you don't have any money, you don't have any this, that, or the other. It's like, I'm sorry. We already have people in power with the money, with the experience, and with the background. And what are they doing with it? Right. Seriously. I mean, you take Nancy Pelosi, you take Hillary Clinton, you take whoever you want. Even if we look at the Republican side, look at Mitch McConnell, look at Paul Ryan, look at Ted Cruz, look at all of these political heavyweights that are currently serving in the Senate, Congress, and as governors, mayors of major cities, the whole 9 yards. What are these people actually doing with their power? They're doing nothing with it. I'm not saying everybody needs to be Julius Caesar, Veni Vidi Vici, but I am saying you need to at least, use that power for the greater good. I mean, that is the point of politics. That's the point of government. Otherwise, we may as well have anarchy and tribal wars, because we would probably be better off at that point. Why do you think gangs exist? Why do you think massive gangs like the Bloods and the Crips exist? Because society has failed them, and we're human beings, we're animals, we're creatures. Our survival instincts kick in, and we will band together with like-minded mentality, which is, I mean, I know that's a bit of a tangent, but you get the idea. This is nonsense.
Tim?
I'd like to also say a word about this viability argument. When I started the campaign, of course, I was told we had no viability. We're up against Godzilla. You know, it was David versus Goliath. And it was only after we raised, I think, first $500,000 and then $1 million. This was before Bernie endorsed me. It was only after we had raised over $1 million that the local press and others nationwide started to accept that maybe we were viable, as if money would translate into viability. By the end of May of 2016, by then we had raised, I think, a couple of $1 million. So everyone is assuming we have some viability. I shouldn't say everyone, but you know, it was less of an issue against us. And we started doing a poll, which I canceled after the first day because it showed me down 60 percentage points or something like that. I had no name recognition still. Yeah. Now, what are we supposed to do at that point? 3 months to go before the election, just say, well, let's give up. Let's throw in the towel because we're not viable, according to some poll. We rolled up our sleeves. We knocked on a lot more doors, and we closed the gap tremendously in the last 3 months and came within just a few thousand votes of beating her. So it always bothers me. It bothered me a lot in my campaign when I would hear people say, well, they're not going to take the campaign seriously because we're not viable. Look, this country is in a crisis, and these are issues that we're fighting for. You can't win if you don't fight. So if folks are telling you you're not viable, wherever you are, whatever the campaign is in any state, don't lose sleep about it. Just work that much harder.
Mm-hmm. Got a lot of fans on here, Tim. I'm putting up some of their comments right now.
Great to hear.
Yeah. The other thing that the article talked about, and we all, I think, knew this, is that Obama really didn't focus on the DNC at all. I mean, he won by Organizing for America, which was a great program. He had a great grassroots army out there, and they were trained by Marshall Gans at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I took his class online. It's an amazing class on how you use public narrative to run a distributed campaign where everybody can sort of speak their truth, as a surrogate for you, if you will. And I actually spoke to Zach Exley, who you and I both know, Tim, from the Bernie campaign about why they were not using that. And his answer to me was, oh, well, we decided to go into a different direction. But I thought it was a great program. But unfortunately, as we all know, Obama dismantled Organizing for America shortly after he became president, and basically ignored the DNC and the rest of the party. It was like it was all about him. And one thing about Howard Dean, who we don't like anymore because he's a big pharmaceutical lobbyist or whatever he is, and always talks smack about Bernie Sanders. But Howard Dean did build the 50-state strategy, which is what I think the Democratic Party needs to do. So I wanted to talk to you about that, but first, I want to put it to you in a question, okay? Why do either of you even want to be Democrats? I mean, the party has been so poorly managed. They've lost over 1,100 seats nationwide. 14 million people left the party after the election. The independents make up the vast plurality of the American electorate. The draft Bernie movement was going strong. I personally thought that Bernie should have accepted their invitation. I think he could win as an independent. I exited myself finally in June after 42 years in the party. So my question to you both is, why are you still hanging in there?
Interestingly enough, people have been asking me more and more, especially with all these revelations coming out, why am I even running as a Democrat when my district is a gerrymandered Republican district and there are plenty of merits of going against him as an incumbent? Now, piggying back on that fact that ever since the DNC chair race and during, I even mentioned that as our rebranding strategy, we should run Democrats in Republican primaries so that we can build our parties in those places where we have been just non-existent for the past 30 years. And so I actually have to say that I am looking at the merits of whether or not it is viable to run as a Democrat in my particular district. Now, to say that we shouldn't run as Democrats at all, I won't say that. I have made this argument time and time again, and I will continue to do so. The party is just that. It is a party. It is a structure. It is just this thing that unites millions of people, that has an infrastructure in every single county and every single state across the country. What it is a unifying force. Now, the brand is ruined. No argument there. And the leadership leaves plenty to be desired. And I'm not just saying that because I ran for the spot. I mean, look at the top-down leadership. You can maybe say that the local, in the rural county, those chairs, they actually give a damn. They're actually trying to actively build the party, get recruitment up, and get their people elected because they actually care. But once you get into these rural party boss type, California state parties and the New Jersey Democratic parties, that's when it becomes the mafia. And it goes up and worse from there. So in many ways, the Democratic Party isn't necessarily salvageable, and it's not necessarily the only course of action. It is merely that the people in charge, the people in power, need to be either replaced or supplanted.
Okay, well, we saw what happened with the election. You lost. You came on very strong at the end. I think a lot of people might have been with you from the beginning rather than Keith Ellison. But Keith Ellison was good, and I think he's tried to do some good things. But basically, after Las Vegas, we know what's happened to Keith Ellison. Tom Perez, I'm sorry, Tim, basically consolidated power like the party boss. When you're talking about the mafia, I was thinking of Eric Bauman, who I call Boss Bauman. I worked very hard for Kimberly Ellis, and I know you endorsed her, Tim. She would have been great. In fact, her whole stump speech, which I was watching again, showed it to my candidate, talked about we need to reinvent what it means to be a Democrat, because she was talking about how her, Tennessee grandma taught her how Democrats were the party who cared for the sick, who cared for the weak, who cared for the needy. And they stopped being that party, pretty much, I guess, with Bill Clinton, with the DLC and, the third way, whatever you want to call it. So she, and I think a lot of the Bernie-crats, believe that they could reinvent the party or return it to back what it once was. And I think the jury is still out as to whether that's going to happen. So, Tim, let me put the question to you. Why are you staying in the party?
Well, I like your conclusion that the jury is still out. And I'll say that I was a Democrat my whole life from the time I started voting. I grew up in New York, where Franklin Roosevelt was revered in my household. I went to a public high school, John F. Kennedy High School, and Kennedy was also a hero. As a law professor for the last 20 years, I've been writing an awful lot about the financial markets and critical of the demise of the New Deal tradition, the New Deal legacy in money and banking and finance. I was very critical, for instance, of deregulations in the 1990s when the Clinton administration gutted what was left of the Glass-Steagall Act, one of the great New Deal measures. So I was a New Deal Democrat my whole life, voted for Barack Obama twice, once with great enthusiasm. However, soon after, I was going to say soon after he took office, but it was actually before he took office. It was in November of 2008. When he had already been elected and he was a president-elect, and he announced his team, including Larry Summers and Timothy Geithner. And at that point, it was clear to me that he was no New Deal Democrat, and it was more of the same. I voted for him again in 2012, but I registered at that time as a non-party affiliation for the first time in my life. I felt like they'll get my vote when I'm voting for the lesser of two evils, but I'm not going to like it. And I felt like there wasn't much of a choice, but clearly I thought he was better than Mitt Romney. So I was a non-party affiliation for close to 3 years, I believe. And I came back to the Democratic Party precisely to challenge Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And, you know, to go after the head of the Democratic Party, right? And, you know, Ronan, your comments were right on point, because you're looking at your district and you're seeing the demographics of it. It's a Republican district. Maybe you run as a Republican. And my principles are unshakable. But the party has been shaken, and the party has been twisted by special interests. I take a look at my district. It has been an overwhelmingly blue district. It was gerrymandered for Wasserman Schultz. It made every sense to run as a Democrat in 2016. Does it mean I'll always run as a Democrat? No. The jury is still out, for sure. There might be an opening to run as an independent, or, you know, I would love, you know, it might sound like a pipe dream. I would love to defeat Wasserman Schultz as a Democrat in the primary, and then to campaign for other progressives all over South Florida and the state of Florida who are challenging incumbents, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. But I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how this is going to play out. I'm just going to stay committed to my own principles and a progressive agenda.
You would even go so far as to say that our platform, our progressive values, however you want to call them, classical liberal, classical conservative, what have you, populism, those things resonate irrespective of political party. Would you agree?
Yes, I certainly agree. Absolutely. Well, take a look at Medicare for All and how it's been polling. Supermajority support among Democrats, supermajority support among independents, and it's kind of close to 50-50 among Republicans. I mean, this is great progress. You know, I think a lot of the movement was already there. I know, Lauren, you and I both kind of crossed paths, although we had not met, in 2011 during Occupy Los Angeles. That Occupy movement, of course, to remind folks, was happening all over this country. And it was a grassroots movement that was expressing a lot of frustration with the incredibly weak recovery, the trickle-down recovery. So, you know, when Bernie Sanders came along, he tapped into that. And that progressive sentiment was already there. But he was a great messenger and a great agent for the progressive movement.
Well, I will say that the Occupy movement and the Bernie Sanders movement were the two biggest movements that I've been involved in, and they were very similar because they all supported the same issues, and the only difference was the Occupy movement intentionally eschewed electoral politics and believed that, in fact, I remember at Occupy LA, if you were a candidate running for office, you couldn't even speak at the General Assemblies. That's how anathema electoral politics was to that movement. But I feel like if they had, you know, and they were criticized for not having an electoral component. And if they had one, clearly Bernie Sanders would have been their candidate, because the concern, the number one issue of his campaign was increasing wealth and income inequality, which was the same as the conversation that Occupy started, which was the 99% versus the 1%. I see that we've gone back into our silos, and we've got the women, and even within the women, we've got the radical feminists fighting the transgenders. I mean, that's a whole nother show I was going to do. And, you know, you have African Americans who are saying, you know, slavery is the original sin, and until we deal with that, we can't talk to you. Or Native Americans are saying the genocide of the Native Americans. But one thing about, you know, the Occupy movement and the Bernie movement is that we were all part of the same tent economically. And I think when we're together, we're a lot stronger than when we're divided and fighting our own issues. And that's just what the right loves to see, is the left fighting amongst itself. Now, I want to pivot to the Justice Democrats now, because somebody put in the comments that we should just support the Justice Democrats, presumably because they're the good guys. Well, I was kind of disturbed when the Justice Democrats started, because I already knew that there was an existing organization called Brand New Congress that was supposed to be exactly what the Justice Democrats were all about, you know, running ordinary people, non-career politicians, to take on, you know, the establishment, to take on the corporate politicians. And then Justice Dem, and I'll never forget Cenk coming on his show talking about Justice Democrats without even acknowledging the existence of Brand New Congress. And it turns out they have the same staff. So what's the difference? The difference is they are only endorsing Democrats, whereas Brand New Congress was willing to endorse, you know, independents, Green Party candidates, even Republicans. I think they have a Republican candidate that they're supporting. But now they're becoming the big gorilla themselves. I mean, a big scandal that you guys probably don't know about, it's happening in California right now, is they endorsed a candidate by the name of Wendy Reed, and she's alienated almost every single progressive that she's ever worked with. She says she's a fighter for this and a fighter for that, but if you go on her Facebook page, she doesn't talk about single-payer health care. She doesn't talk about money in politics. She's a fighter for herself, is what she's a fighter for. And what happened was about 50 people sent emails to Justice Democrats saying, this is a travesty, you have to rescind the endorsement. And they didn't pay any mind to it. They're just still plodding along with Wendy Reed not being responsive at all to the community. And now today, apparently they announced that they are going to run a candidate for Senate here in California by the name of Allison Hartston, who's a great person. I actually had dinner with her the night that Bernie Sanders spoke at the Wiltern Theater. We just happened to be at the same little restaurant. And she's a wonderful person. But you know what? David Hildebrand was already in the race. So why is Justice Democrats running their own candidate and fundraising for her? They're going to knock him right out because they've become, in a way, a political machine. And people were very critical. Now, I'm not going to, you know, impugn their motives. I think their motives are very pure. I'm not going to be like a couple of these internet hosts who I won't name, who basically said, you know, they're in the pocket of the establishment. And because Jeffrey Katzenberg and a whole bunch of, you know, funders of the Democratic Party gave TYT the money, okay, they gave the money to TYT to hire all these great reporters, which is fabulous, that's going to affect the kind of candidates that Justice Democrats puts forward. I don't want to impugn their motives because I think they're great people. I know Cenk, I think he's fantastic. It's like saying that, you know, Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post and Amazon, you know, that the Washington Post is going to be completely neutral about what's going on with the deep state in terms of writing about the deep state, when the Amazon got a $600 million contract from the CIA. So it's very hard when you're the one guy who's controlling these two entities that are supposed to be separate to keep that firewall.
When I first heard about Brand New Congress, I heard about it actually before it launched, and I was praising it from the beginning. I like the idea of challenging establishment Democrats in primaries. Obviously, I kind of like that, since I think the party needs a lot more of those kinds of intramural, intra-party contests if we're going to have any chance of returning the Democratic Party to a progressive orientation. You know, from the very beginning, I was supportive of the idea. I've read only a little bit of this criticism, Lauren, that you've brought up. And I really just haven't paid enough attention to it. Or, you know, I've been really focused on my own race here in Florida.
I do have an opinion about it because I met David during the Progressive Summit. I had heard about Justice Democrats when I was running for the DNC itself. People were nominating me left, right, and center. I knew about Brand New Congress for the very same reasons. I even spoke to the founders or the managers of both of those organizations when I was trying to build and develop our voice. to be partners and collaborate with those efforts. Let them continue to do their congressional vetting and let us start working on the other races, the county and the local levels. All that to summarize this point. I met Ellison Hartwell as well. She is a lovely lady. She's the chairman or one of the chairmen of Wolfpack, which is trying to get Citizens United repealed at every single state level. Wonderful program, wonderful person, very intelligent, very capable woman. I think she could even do the job as senator. I don't understand, like you said, why they are endorsing her over David Hildebrand. If we already have progressives, and I've made this argument time and time again with these special elections, if we already have a progressive, why is it so difficult to go all in for that progressive? I mean, for instance, Tim, I know you're in a primary against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. How many of those primary contenders are progressives? Right now, in my race, it's Wasserman Schultz and myself are the only announced Democrats. And I think it's great that progressives have pretty much rallied around me as the alternative to Wasserman Schultz. I think a lot of folks respect that no one else was challenging her when she was at the height of her power, and that we gave it a real go. We left nothing on the table. There's some Republicans in the field right now, so what's the point that you're making there? The point that I'm making there is we all agree as progressives that you're the guy to replace Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Florida's 23rd, I believe was the district, right? Yeah. And I think we can all safely agree that I'm the progressive we should support in District 1. Yes. Well, there are 433 other districts. If we don't need to be running multiple candidates across them unless we are going to challenge each incumbent, meaning the incumbent and the Republican Party, and then the primary challenger of the Democrats. So whichever way that goes. Those are the tops, how many people we need. We don't need 23 candidates running for Congress, 5 of which are considered progressive. That's dumb, like what happened in Los Angeles. So to have that, like with the against Feinstein, okay, fine. We all agree that Feinstein's time has come. She did her part. She needs to, transition her power to somebody else. We have David. We got him. And if Allison really wants to run for something, can she not run for Congress? Can she not run for governor? Can she not run for like literally any other office under the sun? Does she have to run against David? And why would it be so difficult for, like you said, a national organization that has built its own political wing and mechanisms to elevate somebody else? I'm not saying it because I'm salty that TYT didn't elevate me and put me on their show. Whatever. I get it. I'm not upset. I'm doing what I got to do to win. And I will continue to do that. Would it be nice to have support? Sure. That would be nice for all 435 congressional candidates, right? If Tim could have Cenk on speed dial, I'm sure he would. If he could call Nomiki up and be like, hey, Nomi, can you come over here and do a quick little interview? I'm sure he would. And I know Tim personally. I got to meet him, got to shake his hand. I got to eat pizza with the guy. I know he would bring all the county commissioners, city councilmen, and school board candidates right along with. They might not get more than 30 seconds of hello, Nomiki, but they would get their time because we get the bigger picture. Yeah. So as the bigger picture and looking at it from that way, and to your point earlier, Lauren, we need to be far more consolidated. And I've been making that argument from day one. That's the premise of our voice. That's the premise of Tim's organization. That should be the premise of the Young Turks. We need to find who our guy or gal is and go all in for them. Cenk, have you spoken to him about why
No, because I know him from Occupy. I actually had a dinner with him, and it's so funny. A similar topic. I had a dinner with him because he was representing Wolfpack at the time, with someone from Common Cause who was trying to get money out of politics, with David DeGraw from Occupy Wall Street, and Mary Beth Fielder from Move to Amend. I had about 6 people at this dinner that were all doing different strategies to try to end Citizens United. Mm-hmm. And I was frustrated because I think systematically, well, why can't we all get on the same page and get behind one amendment or get behind one strategy? And also Dylan Radigan was at that dinner. And Dylan Radigan said to me, and I'll never forget, he used this phrase. I thought it was a real thing, but then I Googled it and it didn't come up. He says, I believe in the modern theory of insurgency. And that is where we're all working on the same end from a different angle. And if we all keep working on it, it'll get it out there in the ether enough such that eventually we'll all consolidate on what, the final goal is. But I wanted to ask the audience if there's any questions before we end the show. Would either of you like to make some closing remarks about where you think we need to go from here?
Well, I think it's important that the movement try to stick together. I can see it fragmenting all the time. In my last campaign, Wasserman Schultz and her team managed to infiltrate our campaign with a couple of high-level folks. We didn't even realize until afterwards that they were working for the establishment. And since the campaign, they've actually, you could say, picked off others who had been part of our campaign. And this is what we're up against. And you saw Bernie up against it as well, that the establishment has a lot of corporate money to throw at people. They're able to corrupt people. I see people who claim to be progressives who actually say they prefer Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And it's really incredible. So it's important to not let that kind of negativity get in our way. We have to stay focused on the real issues that are facing this generation, where 90% of the income gains have gone to the top 1%, and the bottom 90% have gotten none of the income gains. This is a historic problem that we're facing right now. And the country has been in a big decline, and I think a lot of folks realize it. And that's why so much energy went to the outside candidates, to both Bernie Sanders and, unfortunately, Donald Trump was perceived as an outside candidate at the time. So a lot of this is not even left versus right. A lot of it is inside versus outside. And, we just got to keep fighting. Like I said before, you can't win if you don't fight.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. The first one was, what do you think of the DNC fraud protest?
In December sometime, or maybe mid-November, they were going to do a DNC fraud protest, which had to do with the lawsuit itself. And of course, to show their ire against the rigging of the primaries, which is now becoming well known. It is becoming prominent, well-known news, even in our mainstream areas. So that protest may be a moot point at this point. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's still something that we need to do. Activism has a role in our political process and our civic engagement. However, it isn't the sole activity that we should do. There are candidates who need help. There are candidates who do not have a national profile, like myself and Tim and Nina and Tulsi and Bernie. There are hundreds of thousands of candidates like Ryan Ross or Stephanie Myers or Lindsey Brown or Stephen Jaffe, or you can name a list of people. David Hildebrand, we mentioned him a few times. These people need your support far more than we need your support. Not to say we don't need it, but you can't just spend all your time on activism and going to protests. You need to go knocking on doors. You need to go phone bank, solicit some donations, send your Facebook messages.
Yeah.
We can't just go to the protests. We need to go there, yell and scream and put our signs up, and then go to work the next day.
Okay, and the next question that was, how do you both plan to get independents to vote for you? Tim, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Last campaign, we got about, I think the estimates were 5,000 or more independents and Republicans who had switched their party affiliation to Democrat, specifically to vote for our campaign, because we were in a closed primary. You had to be a Democrat, registered as a Democrat, to vote in that primary, to vote against Wasserman Schultz and for me. So we reached out to a lot of independents. And look, I think the progressive agenda is going to resonate with independent voters. It's a matter of engaging them door to door and in the local community. And it's a big part of our own efforts.
Well, I had another question, but do you want to answer that one first? Yeah.
That's fine. I was going to just piggyback and say, I agree. The message will resonate with independents or people in general. It resonates across party lines, but please ask the next question.
Okay. So this question is, I want to know what can be done about the pre-primary fundraising deals like the Hillary Victory Fund. How do we stop this to unrig the primaries?
There's very little that you as a candidate or we as a movement can do to stop that. That's part of the problem with parties in general. I'm a huge advocate for eliminating parties in general, because as we have seen and as our founding fathers stated, to create political parties is to create blocks within the politics of our country. And that goes against the notion that we are a free and equal country. If we constantly have to fight each other just to get anything done, and we focus more on what the party wants, we become Big Brother. We become George Orwell's 1984. If not immediately, slowly over time, until it does happen immediately, which is today. Our political framework right now is far more dystopian now than in any other time in history. If you look at Mussolini's Italy, if you look at Stalinist Russia, if you look at Hitler's Germany, and I can't remember the general in Spain, but if you look at that country, and then if you look at the Emperor's Japan, thank you, those were prime times in society where there was massive amounts of economic inequality, massive poverty, massive technological boom and advancement. There was just more information contextually from the past 40 or 50 years. You had the printing press, you had electricity, you had the invention of cars and airplanes, and you had all this stuff that just completely revolutionized society for the times, and only the few benefited from it. And this caused a massive social divide and rift, which allowed for this kind of rhetoric of, look who's causing all this suffering for you, which there's plenty of to go around. The Germans chose to blame the Jews. The Russians chose to blame literally everyone else. The Japanese blamed, not being isolationist, and the Chinese and other Central Asian, so on and so forth. We can no longer just abide by this small thing. If we're going to allow these parties to continue, or if we can't stop those parties, we have to focus our own collaborative grassroots efforts.
We have a question for Tim, and this question is, Tim, how do we address gerrymandering progressives out of races?
I don't know. It's a tough question. There are court challenges to gerrymandering. It's tough to change it at the you could say at the level of the state houses, because the state houses already reflect the gerrymander. In Florida, we've got Democrats outnumbering Republicans by about 200,000 voters, and the Republicans have an 80-40 advantage in the state assembly. So there are court challenges. There's attempts for referendums. Of course, winning big in a year leading up to a census would help, and that's really what hurt us a lot, I think. In 2010, the census came in, and the Democrats got wiped out all around the country, thanks in part to Debbie Wasserman Schultz and other corporate Democrats. But it left the Republicans in positions to then gerrymander based on the census.
People, if you would like guys to read the questions and comment on them, you can feel free to do that. But this was a very good show, and I know when I have you guys on, I get a big audience, and I got a big audience tonight. So if you guys aren't already following me, I do my show here, The Robust Opposition, usually twice a week on Facebook Live, usually Sunday night and Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Pacific time, 10 p.m. Eastern time. So I appreciate that you guys stayed up late to do this show. And I didn't do it yesterday because, of course, the World Series. And I actually had to turn that on, even though I don't follow baseball. And I was just, fascinated by this redheaded guy who looked like he could be in Duck Dynasty. I don't know who that guy was, but that was the most interesting part of the World Series for me. But unfortunately, our Dodgers lost. So everybody told me if I'm to be a real Angelino, and I've been living here for 30 years, then I need to be upset about that. So here's me being upset about the Dodgers losing. And all right, so I'm just going to give you guys each the last word before we go off tonight. Tim?
Well, I just want to first thank you, Lauren, for having me on, and for having me on with Sam. It's wonderful to be back with Sam, sharing a platform. And finally, I just want to say thank you to everyone out there who's watching, who supported me in the last campaign. We couldn't have gotten as far as we did without such massive grassroots support. We need more of that this time around. Wasserman Schultz has been fundraising from the regular PACs and super PACs that she's relied on for all of her congressional career. and we're relying on small donations. So if folks could go online to timcanova.com, throw a few dollars our way, share on social media, and just thank you so much, everyone, for supporting us. And don't give up the fight. Keep the faith and keep fighting.
Great. That's how I always end my show. You stole my line. All right, Sam, now you.
All right, I won't steal that thunder. All I got to say, folks, is I appreciate your ongoing support. Tim, it's always a pleasure. We got to find a way to be in the same room again. Lauren, thank you for this opportunity. I know it was last minute for everybody concerned, but it's worth every second and every cup of coffee. I will say this, though. None of us are being lazy. None of us are being sitting down with our hands, between our legs or anything like that. We are working diligently to make sure that the progressive voice is heard in all of our campaigns and all of our efforts. There are tools and resources readily available. I mean, we can argue about Justice Democrats all day long. There are them. There's Our Revolution. There's Our Voice. There's the web application that they built as well to replace MPG Van. Use these tools. Use these grassroots activities and these tools that are readily available, that are free or low cost. This is how we fight back. So with that, shameless plug, Ronan for Progress at Twitter, Ronan for Congress on Facebook, and then my website, ronanforcongress.com. Please volunteer, donate, whatever you can do to help. We can't make a difference without you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Thank you to my two guests, and have a good night.